In the heart of Johannesburg, Rachel gazed out over the glittering skyline from the floor-to-ceiling windows of a high-rise apartment. She felt as though she had stepped into a different world, far removed from the quiet, small-town life she'd known. Her new surroundings, so rich and glamorous, felt like an escape from the tragic reality that had overtaken her life just weeks before. Rachel had always been close to her parents, their little family inseparable. But one fateful night, a speeding truck, a screech of tires, and a moment of terror had taken them from her. The days that followed were a blur of condolences, paperwork, and the haunting silence that now filled the house she could no longer bear to stay in. She felt utterly alone, her heart heavy with loss, yet no path forward. Desperate for connection, Rachel found herself scrolling through online forums and social media late into the night. It was on one of those lonely nights that she encountered Malcolm, a man whose profile radiated warmth and stability. He was older, distinguished, and had an aura of sophistication that intrigued her. They began exchanging messages, his words laced with sympathy and understanding. He seemed to know just what to say, offering her a sense of comfort that she craved so deeply. After a week of messages and late-night phone calls, Malcolm proposed an idea that felt both exciting and terrifying. "Come stay with me in Johannesburg," he offered. "You need a break, and I'd love to show you the city. You deserve to be cared for, Rachel. Let me do that for you." His words wrapped around her like a warm blanket, and before she could second-guess herself, she found herself on a bus bound for Johannesburg. Malcolm had assured her that he would handle everything: her accommodation, food, entertainment. All she needed to do was relax and allow herself to heal. When she arrived, Malcolm was waiting for her, and she couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at the man standing before her. Tall, with salt and pepper hair and a demeanor that exuded confidence, Malcolm was the picture of wealth and success. He wore a tailored suit that fit him perfectly, and he greeted her with a warm smile that made her feel seen and valued. "Welcome to Johannesburg," he said, his voice deep and reassuring. "This is a new beginning for you, Rachel." Rachel's new life unfolded like a dream. The apartment was spacious, with polished floors, luxurious furniture, and a view that seemed to stretch on forever. She had her own room, decorated with fresh flowers and soft, expensive linens. Malcolm spared no expense in making her feel at home. He treated her to lavish dinners at five-star restaurants, where they dined on exotic dishes she had never tasted before. They shopped at upscale boutiques, and he encouraged her to buy whatever she liked. The days passed in a blur of luxury, laughter, and whispered promises of a future together. Rachel began to feel herself opening up to him, sharing memories of her parents, her fears, her dreams. Malcolm listened with an intensity that made her feel as though she were the only person in his world. "Rachel, you're special," he would tell her. "I want to take care of you. I want to show you what life can really be like." For the first time since her parents' passing, Rachel felt truly seen and valued. She was enamored, not only with Malcolm but with the life he represented. A life of security, where pain and hardship were replaced by warmth and abundance. She allowed herself to believe that this was her new reality, that Malcolm was the answer to her prayers. But as the days turned into weeks, Rachel began to notice subtle shifts in Malcolm's demeanor. He seemed distracted, often glancing at his phone with a furrowed brow. Occasionally, he would step out for hours without explanation, leaving her alone in the vast, silent apartment. When she questioned him, he brushed it off with vague reassurances, saying he was simply handling some business. One evening, as they sat by the window overlooking the city lights, Rachel tried to press him on the future. She wanted to know what would happen once her 2-week stay was over. "Malcolm, what happens after this? Will we still be together?" she asked hesitantly, her heart pounding. He looked at her, his gaze unreadable, and took her hands in his. "Rachel, you worry too much. Just enjoy the moment. I have something special planned for you. You'll see." He leaned in and kissed her forehead, his lips lingering for a moment. "Trust me." Her heart swelled with affection, but a small seed of doubt had taken root. She pushed it aside, wanting so desperately to believe in the dream he'd spun for her. Then came the morning when Rachel woke to an empty apartment. She stretched, expecting to find Malcolm preparing breakfast or perhaps reading the paper in the living room. But there was no sign of him. She searched the apartment, calling his name, her voice echoing in the emptiness. Panic began to claw at her as she checked her phone, only to find no new messages. It was then that she noticed a note on the dining table, beside an elegant leather bag. Her name was scrawled across the envelope in Malcolm's distinctive handwriting. She picked it up, her fingers trembling, and began to read. "My dearest Rachel, I didn't want to wake you. I wanted this to be a surprise. There's something I've prepared for you, something that will change your life. It's my way of saying goodbye and a parting gift to keep you safe. You're going to need this, love, for raw beef liver. Trust me, it's for your own good. All my love, Malcolm." Rachel frowned, rereading the note. "Raw beef liver," she murmured, confused. She opened the leather bag beside the note and gasped at the sight of neatly stacked cash. It was more money than she had ever seen in one place. At first, she thought it might be part of his surprise, but as the day wore on and Malcolm did not return, her excitement turned to anxiety. His cryptic words lingered in her mind, casting a dark shadow over her thoughts. She spent the day pacing, calling his phone only to be met with an automated voicemail. Night fell, and Rachel was alone in the silent apartment. She lay in bed, her mind spinning, until a strange itching sensation began at the base of her scalp. She ignored it at first, attributing it to stress, but as the hours passed, the itching intensified, becoming almost unbearable. When she ran her fingers through her hair, she felt something small and wriggling. Her heart raced as she leaped out of bed, rushing to the bathroom mirror. Her fingers trembled as she parted her hair, revealing small, white worms squirming at the roots. Horror filled her, and she stumbled back, her mind refusing to accept the reality of what she was seeing. The itching grew worse, and in a desperate panic, she remembered Malcolm's strange note, "You're going to need this, love, for raw beef liver." The words echoed in her mind, filling her with a cold dread. She hurried to the kitchen, her hands shaking as she searched the refrigerator, finding a package of raw beef liver that Malcolm had left behind. With no other option, Rachel followed the cryptic instructions, placing the raw liver on her scalp. The relief was immediate, the worms latched onto the meat, sparing her scalp. She gagged at the sensation, her stomach churning, but the relief was enough to numb her disgust. She sat alone in the dimly lit kitchen, tears streaming down her face as the horrifying reality of her situation sank in. Malcolm was gone, leaving her with a monstrous curse that she could scarcely comprehend. In the days that followed, Rachel found herself trapped in a desperate routine. Each day, the itching returned, and each day she was forced to place fresh liver on her scalp to keep the worms at bay. Her once luxurious surroundings now felt like a prison, each lavish detail a mocking reminder of the life she thought she was stepping into. Rachel realized that Malcolm had never intended to stay. The lavish dinners, the gifts, the promises, they had all been a cruel illusion, a means to lure her into his twisted scheme. Alone and isolated, she became a prisoner to the curse he had left behind. As her supplies dwindled, Rachel's hope began to fade. She was caught in a nightmare with no escape, her life hanging by a fragile thread that Malcolm had cut without a second thought. Rachel jolted awake, startled by the silence that filled the apartment. For a moment, She thought she'd heard Malcolm's voice whispering through the stillness. But as she glanced around, she found herself alone in the vast, luxurious space. The note and bag of cash lay on the table, a haunting reminder of the strange farewell Malcolm had left her with. She rubbed her eyes, trying to shake off the disorientation, but as she sat up, a dull, prickling sensation at the base of her scalp began to capture her attention. She brushed it off as stress, her mind reeling with questions and the gnawing uncertainty of Malcolm's intentions. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply, disturbingly wrong. Walking slowly to the dining table, Rachel picked up the note and reread it. "You're going to need this, love, for raw beef liver." The cryptic words sent a chill through her spine. Why liver? And why the rush to leave her with this odd instruction? Her stomach tightened with unease, and the prickling on her scalp intensified, now accompanied by an itch she could no longer ignore. Malcolm's betrayal was a raw wound, one that cut deeper than she could have ever imagined. She trusted him, allowed him into her life, and he had left her with a living nightmare. The following days blurred into a grotesque routine. The itching would return each morning, signaling the worm's relentless hunger. Rachel would search for fresh liver, pressing the cold, bloody meat to her scalp as she fought to hold back her sobs. She rarely ventured out of the apartment, too terrified of encountering someone who might notice the bizarre and horrifying state of her head. Her life became a cycle of dread and desperation, and each day the worms grew hungrier, their demands becoming more insatiable. She tried to stretch the liver supply as best as she could, but it never seemed to last. The worms would chew through it quickly, leaving her scalp raw and bleeding. On the 5th day, the supply ran out. Rachel panicked, clutching the empty fridge door as her mind raced. She counted the remaining cash, stuffing the bills into her purse with shaking hands before bolting from the apartment. The trip to the butcher felt surreal. She moved in a daze, her scalp ablaze with the biting itch of the worms. As she handed over the cash, she avoided the butcher's curious gaze, clutching the bag of fresh liver tightly against her chest. She ran back to the apartment, locking herself inside as she pressed the liver to her scalp, feeling the worms swarm to the fresh offering. A wave of nausea overtook her, but the relief was worth the horror. Yet, with each passing day, Rachel found it harder to keep up with the demands of her curse. The worms' relentless hunger became more intense, as if they were growing, multiplying. Her money dwindled, and with it, her hope of ever escaping the nightmare Malcolm had left her trapped in. One evening, after days of this relentless torment, Rachel found herself staring out the apartment window, her reflection ghostly against the city lights. She looked pale, hollow-eyed, a shadow of the person she had been. The betrayal weighed on her like a leaden cloak, and each itch, each squirm under her scalp reminded her of the cruel reality that Malcolm had inflicted upon her. With a shaky hand, she reached up, brushing her fingers against the now constant thrumming of worms beneath her skin. Her desperation grew, a gnawing despair that clawed at her very soul. She thought of calling for help, of somehow alerting someone to her plight, but shame kept her silent. How could she explain what was happening? Who would believe her? As her mind spiraled, she remembered Malcolm's words, his promise of a new beginning. The twisted irony of it all crushed her, and she collapsed to her knees, sobbing into her hands. The wealth, the luxury, the illusion of love, he had used it all to trap her in this monstrous fate. She realized that this was Malcolm's parting gift, a death sentence wrapped in promises and deceit. The final days crept up on her like a dark fog. Her funds were almost gone, and the butcher's questioning looks had grown harder to ignore. She could feel herself slipping, her body weakening as the worm's insatiable hunger drained her of energy. Her scalp was raw, the constant feeding leaving patches of her hair clumped and matted with blood. One cold, quiet morning, Rachel awoke to find that the last piece of liver was nearly gone, shriveled and dried from the worm's relentless feeding. Her heart sank as she realized the full weight of her predicament. She had no money left, no strength to continue the fight. Her vision blurred, and her breaths came shallow, her body succumbing to the slow poison Malcolm had left in her. As she sat by the window, her gaze drifting over the city she had once hoped to call home, Rachel felt the last of her hope slipping away. She thought of her parents, of the life she had once known, a life filled with love and warmth. But that world was gone, torn away by a cruel twist of fate and a man who had turned her grief into a weapon against her. In her final moments, Rachel felt a strange, bitter peace settle over her. She had fought, clung to the hope of survival, but now there was nothing left. The worms, ravenous and merciless, began to gnaw at her scalp, their feeding frenzy unchecked. She could feel them burrowing deeper, their tiny bodies wriggling toward her mind, and a numbness settled over her. As her vision faded, Rachel's last thoughts were of freedom, an escape from the torment, the deception, and the horror that had become her reality. The world went dark, and in that final silence, she found release from the nightmare that had claimed her.